The fluorescent light in the faculty bathroom hummed at 6:47 a.m., a sterile sound that vibrated in Marcus Reed's teeth. She leaned into the cracked mirror, the cold porcelain of the sink biting into her palms, and gently pressed a fingertip to her jaw. The pain was a sharp, electric crack that made her vision swim. She exhaled a shaky breath, forcing her hands to stay steady as she reached for the heavy-duty concealer. 3 layers. It always took at least 3 to bury the dark, angry purple blooming from her eye to her throat, a mark left by a man who had finally stopped being careful where he aimed. Marcus straightened her blazer, performing the silent mantra she had mastered over the last 11 months. Cover, blend, smile, survive. She had 23 second graders waiting for her. They needed her to be the anchor, so she became the anchor. She stepped into the hallway and nearly collided with a small, still figure. Jadon Cole stood there, his school blazer perfectly pressed, his expression as serious as a judge's. At 7 years old, he carried a weight that suggested he had never once been caught off guard. He didn't look at Marcus with the wide-eyed panic of a child. He looked at her bruise like a mathematician observing a complex problem he was already solving. "Good morning, sweetheart," Marcus forced the professional. "Everything is fine," smile she used for parents. Jadon didn't smile back. He reached out, his small hand incredibly gentle as it rested against her uninjured cheek. "Who did this to you, Mr. Reed?" His voice was quiet, stripped of all childish inflection. "I'm okay, Jadon, Who did this?" he repeated. Marcus found she had no lie strong enough for his dark, knowing eyes, so she stayed silent. Jadon nodded once, a slow, composed movement. He dropped his hand, but the intensity in his gaze didn't flicker. "Don't cry," he said with terrifying certainty. "My dad will fix it." Marcus stayed frozen for a heartbeat longer than professional decorum allowed, the ghost of Jadon's small, warm palm still lingering on her skin. The hallway was beginning to fill with the distant, chaotic symphony of slamming lockers and high-pitched morning greetings, but in the small radius between the teacher and the boy, the air felt thick and unmoving. She searched his face for the typical signs of childhood distress, the trembling lip or the watery eyes, but Jadon Cole offered none. He stood with a stillness that was almost architectural, his school tie knotted with a precision that mirrored the surgical engine of the black car Marcus had seen in the lot. "I'm fine, baby," Marcus whispered, the lie tasting like copper in her mouth. She adjusted her blazer, her fingers brushing the stiff fabric she used to hide what the 3 layers of concealer couldn't. She forced the practiced, radiant smile that had served as her primary shield for the past 11 months. It was a smile designed to reassure the world that everything was normal, a mask crafted to ensure the 23 children depending on her felt safe. Jadon didn't blink. He didn't buy the performance. He looked at the dark, angry purple blooming beneath her eye not with pity but with the cold, objective focus of someone calculating a trajectory. "Who did this to you, Mr. Reed?" he asked again. The repetition wasn't an inquiry, it was a demand for a name. When Marcus remained silent, unable to bring Julian's name into the sanctuary of the school, Jadon finally lowered his hand. He didn't look disappointed. Instead, he gave a single, composed nod, as if her silence had provided every piece of evidence he required. The gravity in his dark eyes was unnerving, possessing a weight that belonged to a much older man, a man who had seen things and filed them away for later. "My dad will fix it," he said simply, his voice devoid of the bravado usually found in playground boasts. It was a statement of fact, as immutable as gravity. Marcus patted his shoulder, her hand trembling slightly as she began to lead him toward the classroom, dismissing the comment as the sweet, empty promise of a protective child. She had no way of knowing that Jadon carried himself this way because he was the son of a man who never failed to finish an order. She had no idea that by nightfall, the invisible machinery of the dragon would already be turning, and the man who had been careless with her safety was about to find every exit in his life permanently closed. The afternoon bell traditionally brought a chaotic energy to the school's front gates, but today, the atmosphere felt strangely calibrated. As Marcus stepped out onto the sidewalk, guiding her line of students through the humid air, she felt a prickle of awareness at the base of her neck. The usual fleet of idling SUVs and minivans was there, but parked slightly apart, occupying a space that seemed to expand around it, was a black sedan so polished it looked like a tear in the fabric of the afternoon. Standing beside the vehicle was the architecture of a man. Kang Minyi did not lean against the car. He stood with a verticality that commanded the entire city block. His suit was a masterpiece of charcoal wool, tailored with such lethal precision that it made the surrounding world look frayed and disorganized. He didn't wear sunglasses. He didn't need them. His eyes were dark and unhurried, scanning the crowd with the detached efficiency of a predator who had already mapped every exit. When Jadden spotted him, the boy didn't break into a run like the other children. He walked with the same measured, gravitational pull as his father. Marcus felt a sudden, sharp instinct to protect her student, but as she approached the man, the air seemed to grow cold. Up close, Minyi was even more intimidating, a silent, powerful presence that felt like a dormant volcano. He didn't look at his son first. He looked at Marcus. The scrutiny was physical. His gaze traveled over her face, settling on the edge of her jaw where the third layer of concealer was beginning to fail under the afternoon sun. He didn't flinch. And he didn't offer a look of pity. Instead, his eyes narrowed by a fraction of a millimeter, a microscopic shift that signaled a profound and dangerous change in the atmosphere. "Mr. Reed," Jadden said, his voice small but steady, "this is my father." Minyi didn't offer a hand. He gave a slight, formal bow of the head that felt more like a vow than a greeting. "Jadden speaks of you often," he said. His voice was a low, resonant baritone that carried the weight of absolute authority. "He tells me you are a teacher who cares deeply for her students, that you are observant." Marcus felt her throat tight. She opened her mouth to offer a polite pleasantry, but the words died as she realized he wasn't just looking at her. He was reading the history written in the bruises she thought she'd hidden. He looked at her the way a general looks at a map before a campaign. "Thank you for looking after my son," Minyi continued, his voice dropping an octave, turning into something private and chilling. "It is only right that someone looks after you in return." Before Marcus could respond, he had opened the door for Jadden. As the car pulled away, leaving nothing but the faint scent of expensive leather and cold ozone, Marcus realized the weather of her life was about to change. The dragon had arrived, and he had seen everything. The shift in the atmosphere began the very next morning, a subtle recalibration of the world that Marcus felt before she saw. As she pulled her aging sedan onto the street, the usual prickle of anxiety, the habit of checking the rearview mirror for Julian's car, was replaced by a different kind of awareness. A sleek, silver SUV sat idling 2 houses down, its windows opaque and as reflective as dark water. It didn't follow her closely. It simply existed in her periphery, a silent sentinel that moved when she moved and paused when she paused. At school, the change was even more pronounced. The playground, usually a theater of unmonitored chaos, felt anchored. A man in a dark, inconspicuous windbreaker stood near the far fence, ostensibly reading a newspaper, yet his posture remained as coiled and vertical as Minyi's. When Marcus led her students out for recess, she caught the glint of sunlight off a lens from a parked car across the street. For the first time in 11 months, the shadows surrounding her didn't feel like they were reaching out to pull her under. They felt like a perimeter. Inside the classroom, Jadden remained the eye of the storm. He worked on his spelling transition with a serene intensity, never once mentioning the conversation from the day before. Yet when Marcus walked past his desk, she noticed a small detail: a new high-end GPS tracker keychain attached to his backpack, glowing with a steady, reassuring blue pulse. The surveillance was surgical. It was in the way a delivery van stayed parked near her apartment complex long after the driver should have finished his route. It was in the way the local bodega clerk, usually indifferent, suddenly treated her with a hushed, reverent urgency after 2 men in tailored suits stopped in for water. Marcus found herself catching her own reflection in the tinted glass of these passing vehicles, no longer seeing a woman scurrying to hide, but a person being framed by an invisible, formidable architecture of power. The fear didn't vanish, but it transformed. It shifted from the sharp, jagged terror of Julian's unpredictability to a heavy, humming realization that she was no longer alone in the dark. As she locked her classroom door that evening, she looked toward the street. The silver SUV was there, a silent promise kept. The dragon wasn't just watching. He was waiting for the moment the predator in her life decided to show his face. And for the first time, Marcus wasn't the only one counting the minutes. The transition from the fortified silence of the school day to the suffocating tension of the apartment felt like crossing a border into occupied territory. Marcus kept her hand on the doorknob for a second too long, bracing herself, before the heavy scent of scorched grain hit her. It was the smell of a looming outburst, the acrid, bitter aroma of burnt rice drifting from the kitchen. Julian was sitting at the small dining table, the flickering light of a single overhead bulb casting long, jagged shadows across his face. He didn't look up as she entered. He simply stirred a pot of blackened remains, the metal spoon scraping against the bottom with a rhythmic, grating screech. In the silence of the room, the sound was as loud as a gunshot. "You're late," he said, his voice a low, dangerous vibration. It was the tone that usually preceded the breaking of glass, the one that made Marcus's heart perform a frantic, trapped staccato against her ribs. She moved toward the counter, her movements practiced and small, trying to minimize her physical presence in the room. "There was a line at the bus stop, Julian. I'm sorry," she whispered, her eyes fixed on the floor. She could feel his gaze crawling over her, searching for the crack in her armor, for the moment her fear would give him the permission he sought. But as Julian stood up, the scrape of his chair echoing like a threat, a sudden heavy thud sounded from the hallway outside. It wasn't the clumsy stumble of a neighbor. It was a deliberate, singular weight. Then, a low, electronic chirp, the sound of a high-end security system being bypassed or recalibrated, vibrated through the thin walls. Julian froze, his hand tightening around the spoon. He moved toward the door, his jaw set in a familiar, ugly snarl, but as he reached for the handle, he stopped. Through the narrow gap of the floor, the shadow of two pairs of feet appeared, perfectly still, perfectly vertical. The air in the apartment suddenly felt pressurized, as if the world outside had become an immovable wall. For the first time in 11 months, the weather of Julian's rage met a cold front it couldn't penetrate. He didn't open the door. He retreated, his brow furrowing in a confusion that looked a lot like the beginning of fear. Marcus stood by the scorched pot, the smell of burnt rice still hanging in the air, but the terror was different now. The storm was here, but it wasn't coming for her. It was standing guard at her door, and it was waiting for him to make a move. The morning didn't break with the usual frantic alarm or the heavy, rhythmic tread of Julian's mood. Instead, it was shattered by 3 sharp, rhythmic raps against the apartment door. They weren't the hesitant knocks of a neighbor or the erratic pounding of a debt collector. They were precise, heavy, and possessed a finality that made the air in the hallway feel suddenly, impossibly dense. Julian, who had spent the night in a state of agitated paranoia after the previous evening's shadows, surged toward the door. His face was a mask of defensive rage, his hands curled into white-knuckled fists. "I told you to stay away," he roared, wrenching the door open with enough force to rattle the hinges. He stopped mid-breath. The hallway was no longer the empty, dimly lit corridor Marcus knew. It had been transformed into a corridor of charcoal wool and obsidian glass. 2 men stood on either side of the door, their hands folded in front of them with the relaxed readiness of professional soldiers. But it was the man in the center who drew the air out of the room. Kang Minyi did not look like a visitor. He looked like the new owner of the building. His suit was a dark shadow against the peeling wallpaper, and his eyes were as cold as a winter sea. "Mr. Holt," Minyi said. His voice wasn't raised, yet it carried over Julian's fatting bravado with the weight of a gavel. "You have been making a great deal of noise in a space that requires silence. Who the hell are you?" Julian spat, though his voice wavered, his eyes darting to the men behind Minyi. Minyi didn't answer. He simply stepped forward. He didn't ask for permission, and he didn't wait for Julian to move. The physical presence of the man was so absolute that Julian found himself retreating, step by stumbling step, back into the living room he had dominated for nearly a year. Marcus stood by the kitchen table, her heart a drumbeat of disbelief as the architecture of a suit filled her doorway. One of the men stepped past Minyi, placing a heavy, high-end briefcase on the scarred dining table. The click of the latches was the only sound in the room. Minyi didn't look at the room's clutter or the scorched pot still sitting on the stove. He kept his gaze fixed on Julian, a look of profound, detached observation. "We are here to discuss the architecture of your future," Minyi said softly. "It is a structure that no longer includes this address, or this city." Marcus watched as Julian's face drained of color. The predator was realizing for the first time that he had been hunted by something much larger than himself. The organization had arrived, and they hadn't come to negotiate. They had come to clear the ground. The tension in the apartment didn't vanish after Minyi's men escorted Julian into the back room. It simply changed state, shifting from a jagged, unpredictable heat to a cool, pressurized silence. Marcus found herself standing by the window, her arms wrapped tightly around her chest, watching the rain begin to streak the glass like tears she hadn't yet allowed herself to cry. The silver SUV was still there, a dark anchor in the gray afternoon. A soft, rhythmic click of dress shoes on the hardwood announced Minyi's approach. He didn't hover or crowd her space. Instead, he stopped at the edge of the kitchen, pulling out a chair at the small, scarred table where the burnt rice still sat in its pot, a grim monument to a life she was currently shedding. "The air here is heavy, Mr. Reed," Minyi said, his voice a calm, resonant low that seemed to vibrate in the floorboards. "It is not an environment conducive to the work you do. Jadden tells me you are teaching them about the stars this week. A person cannot see the stars from a cellar." He placed a small, heavy vellum envelope on the table. Beside it, he set a steaming paper cup from a local cafe Marcus frequented, the one Julian always mocked for being an unnecessary luxury. The scent of roasted beans and vanilla bean was a sudden, sharp intrusion of grace in the cramped room. "I don't understand," Marcus whispered, finally turning to face him. Her hands were trembling, a delayed reaction to the sudden vacuum Julian's absence had created. "Why are you doing this? You don't even know me." Minyi looked at her, his dark eyes unreadable but devoid of the sharpness he had used on Julian. "My son knows you. He saw a debt that needed to be settled, and in my world we do not leave debts unpaid. You gave him a sense of safety in your classroom. It is only right that I return the favor." He nudged the envelope toward her. Inside was a key, heavy, brass and cold, and a slip of paper with an address in a quiet, tree-lined neighborhood near the school. It was an area Marcus had often walked through, admiring the brownstones and the way the streetlights felt like a promise of protection rather than a spotlight for predators. "This is too much," she said, her voice cracking. "I can't pay for a place like that. I'm a teacher, Mr. Kang. I live within the lines." "The lines have moved," Minyi replied simply. He stood up, the charcoal wool of his suit catching the dim light. He looked at the coffee cup, then back at her. "There is no lease in your name. There are no utilities for you to transfer. It is a space that exists outside the reach of anyone who would seek to diminish you. You will move tonight. My men will handle the logistics. You will take only what you wish to keep." Marcus looked at the scorched pot, the mismatched chairs, and the cracked mirror in the bathroom where she had applied 3 layers of concealer that morning. She realized with a sudden jarring clarity that there was nothing in this room worth the weight of the memories attached to them. "And if I say no?" she asked, a final spark of the independence she had fought to keep alive flickering in her eyes. Minyi paused at the door. He didn't look back, but his silhouette was an immovable wall against the hallway light. "Then I will wait," he said, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "I will wait until you know that you are worth the effort. I will wait until you realize that safety is not a gift, it is a requirement. But the car will be downstairs at 8 o'clock. I suggest you finish your coffee before it gets cold." As the door clicked shut behind him, Marcus picked up the cup. It was warm, real, and remarkably simple. She took a sip, the bitter sweetness grounding her, and for the first time in 11 months, she didn't look at the clock to see how much time she had left before the storm returned. She looked at the key, and then she began to pack. The transformation of Julian's world did not begin with a blow, but with a ledger. While Marcus sat in the quiet safety of her new kitchen, miles away in a sterile, glass-walled office that overlooked the city's industrial vein, Kang Minyi sat behind a desk of polished obsidian. He did not look like a man of violence in this light. He looked like a master weaver pulling at the loose threads of a cheap garment. On the screen before him, Julian Holt's life was being reduced to a series of red numbers and predatory interest rates. Julian had always lived on the jagged edge of his own recklessness, a man who thought his secrets were buried in the dark corners of underground sportsbooks and late-night card games. He didn't realize that in the digital age, every vice leaves a footprint, and every debt has an owner. By 2:00 a.m., Minyi's analysts had mapped the entire topography of Julian's failures. There were payday loans with interest rates that resembled ransom demands, gambling markers held by men who were dangerous only to those weaker than themselves, and a mounting stack of unpaid credit accounts that Julian had ignored with the arrogance of a man who believed he was untouchable. Minyi scrolled through the data with a detached, surgical focus. "Acquire them," he said, his voice a low vibration in the quiet room. "Every single one. Sir, some of these collections are already in legal proceedings," an aide whispered from the shadows of the office. "Then buy the law firms," Minyi replied without looking up. "I want every cent he owes to this city to be owed to me by dawn. Every car note, every past-due utility, every shadow he thinks he can run from. I want the ground he walks on to be my property." By the time the sun began to bleed over the horizon, Julian Holt was a man whose life had been systematically bought and partitioned. He woke up in the back of a black sedan, his head throbbing, only to find a thick folder resting on the seat beside him. It wasn't a threat, it was a map of his own extinction. Every page was a photocopy of a debt he thought he'd hidden, now stamped with a new corporate seal, a stylized dragon that mirrored the pin on Minyi's lapel. The genius of the organization's strategy was its bloodless efficiency. They didn't need to break Julian's bones when they could break his reality. As the sedan moved through the early morning fog, Julian realized that his bank accounts were frozen. His credit cards were pieces of useless plastic, and even the lease on the truck he prized had been terminated for a violation of terms he hadn't even known existed. He was being stripped bare, layer by layer, until there was nothing left but the raw, trembling center of his own cowardice. The predator who had spent 11 months making Marcus Reed feel small was discovering that the world was suddenly much larger than his reach. Minyi wasn't just taking Marcus away from him. He was taking the very air Julian needed to breathe in this city. He had mapped the abuser's debts, and the total was a price Julian could never hope to pay. The noose wasn't made of rope. It was made of paper, and it was tightening with every mile the car drove toward the edge of the city limits. The school bell rang at 3:00 p.m., a sound that usually signaled the beginning of Marcus's most anxious hour. But as she led her students toward the pickup line, the air felt different, thicker, as if the oxygen itself had been reinforced. She scanned the row of waiting cars, her heart doing its customary frantic stutter. Then she saw it. Julian's truck was idling at the far end of the curb, a jarring, rusted intrusion against the orderly line of SUVs. He shouldn't have been there. He should have been at work, but the desperation of a man whose world was dissolving had brought him to the one place he still thought he could control. Julian stepped out of the truck, his face a frantic mask of sweat and mounting rage. He began to stride toward Marcus, his eyes wild, his mouth opening to launch a familiar, piercing shout. Marcus felt the old instinct to flinch, to apologize, to hide. Then the world went silent. It happened with a precision that was almost beautiful. A black sedan, appearing as if from the pavement itself, glided into the space between Julian and the sidewalk, cutting off his path like a physical wall. Simultaneously, two other dark vehicles pulled in behind his truck, boxing him in with a mechanical finality. Julian stopped mid-step, his bravado instantly evaporating as four men in charcoal suits stepped out of the cars. They didn't run, and they didn't shout. They simply occupied the space around him, creating a perimeter of silent, lethal intent. In the center of the formation stood Kang Minyi, He didn't look at the crowd of terrified parents or the curious children. His focus was entirely on the man who had dared to bring his violence to a place of learning. "Mr. Holt," Minyi said, his voice a low, terrifyingly calm anchor in the sudden quiet. "You are trespassing on a sanctuary." "This is none of your business," Julian shrieked, his voice cracking, his eyes darting toward the men who had closed in on him. "Marcus, get over here." Minyi didn't move, yet Julian stumbled back as if he had been struck. One of the men stepped forward, placing a hand on Julian's shoulder, a gesture that looked like a friendly greeting but carried enough downward pressure to make Julian's knees buckle. "The architecture of your life has been dismantled," Minyi continued, stepping closer until he was inches from Julian's face. He pulled a thin silver watch from his pocket and clicked the dial. "You have exactly 90 seconds to realize that you no longer exist in this city. Every debt I bought this morning is now due. Your home is locked. Your vehicle is being repossessed as we speak. You have no money, no leverage, and very soon you will have no breath if you stay." The playground was frozen. Teachers and parents watched in a hushed, reverent awe as the predator was systematically reduced to prey. Marcus stood by Jadden, her hand resting on the boy's shoulder. She felt Jadden's small hand cover hers, his grip firm and reassuring. He wasn't afraid. He was watching his father fix it with the same calm he used to solve a math problem. Minyi leaned in closer to Julian, his voice dropping to a whisper that only Julian, and perhaps the ghosts of his past, could hear. "If you ever look toward this school again, if you ever utter the name Marcus Reed, I will stop being a businessman. Do you understand the difference?" Julian couldn't speak. He could only nod, a frantic, pathetic motion. The 90 seconds were up. The men stepped back, opening a narrow path toward the silver sedan. They didn't arrest him, they simply moved him. Julian scrambled into the back seat, his eyes fixed on the floor, and as the door clicked shut, the black vehicles moved in perfect unison, disappearing into the afternoon traffic as quickly as they had arrived. The silence remained for a heartbeat longer. Marcus looked down at her hand. It wasn't trembling. She looked at the spot where the truck had been, now empty and unremarkable. The predator was gone, not through a struggle, but through an erasure. She took a deep breath, the air tasting of nothing but rain and freedom, and for the first time in 11 months, she didn't have to look behind her. The aftermath of the storm was not a theatrical celebration. It was a profound, ringing silence. 3 weeks had passed since the black sedans had carved Julian out of the city's geography, and Marcus Reed was finding that the hardest part of being safe was learning how to inhabit it. In her new apartment, the floorboards didn't groan under the weight of an approaching threat, and the air didn't carry the metallic tang of burnt rice. For the first time in nearly a year, the quiet didn't feel like the breathless pause before a blow. It just felt like quiet. On a Tuesday afternoon, Marcus sat at her desk in the empty classroom, the golden slant of 4:00 p.m. sunlight stretching unhurried across the alphabet posters. She was grading papers, but her hand paused over a stack of drawings from the day's art period. She found herself staring at the window, realized she hadn't checked the parking lot once in the last hour. The hypervigilance that had been her constant companion was beginning to atrophy, replaced by a strange, light buoyancy in her chest. A soft scuff of a shoe made her look up. Jadden Cole stood in the doorway, his backpack slung over one shoulder, his blazer as immaculate as the day they first met. He didn't come in with the frantic energy of a child. He moved with that same architectural composure, a miniature reflection of the man who had rewritten the rules of Marcus's life. "My dad is here," Jadden said, his voice steady and calm. "Thank you, Jadden," Marcus smiled, and this time the smile reached her eyes undisturbed by the tension of hidden bruises. "I'll be out in just a moment." Jadden walked toward her desk and placed a single sheet of drawing paper on the blotter. He didn't wait for a critique or a grade. He simply nodded once, a gesture of completion, and turned to head toward the exit. Marcus picked up the paper. It was a crayon drawing, rendered with the focused precision Jadden applied to everything. In the center was a tall, vibrant tree with deep roots, and beneath it sat a figure that was clearly Marcus, surrounded by a perimeter of tall, dark shields that looked remarkably like the silhouettes of suits. but it was the sky that caught her breath. It wasn't the usual scribbled blue. It was a vast, clear expanse of yellow and gold, labeled in Jadden's neat, blocky print, the safe place. She walked out to the curb, the drawing clutched gently in her hand. The black sedan was idling at the far end of the lane, its polished surface reflecting the peaceful neighborhood. Kang Minyi was standing beside the door, his posture as vertical and commanding as ever. He didn't say a word as she approached, but as their eyes met, the microscopic shift in his expression, a softening of the iron, told her everything he wouldn't say aloud. He wasn't just a benefactor or a ghost in the machinery of the underworld. He was a witness who had refused to look away. "Mr. Kang," Marcus said, stopping a respectful distance away. "Thank you for the stars." Minyi gave a slight formal bow of the head. "The stars were always there, Mr. Reed. You just needed someone to hold the shadows back so you could see them." As the car pulled away, Marcus stood on the sidewalk, watching the sunlight play off the pavement. She realized then that protection didn't always look like a shield. Sometimes it looked like a child's drawing, a key to a quiet home, and the permission to finally stop looking behind her. She turned back toward the school, her gait steady and her head held high, finally fluent in the long-forgotten language of safety. The dragon was still watching, and for the first time in a very long time, Marcus Reed was home. Comment for part 2, and tell us where are you watching from. Don't hesitate to subscribe.